Today we'll have a great talk called How Elixir Made Me Write Better JavaScript by Grant Powell, who's from here at SalesLoft. And I'm really looking forward to this talk. So without further ado, here's Grant.
So can you guys hear me? Yep. Who was here for a Bruce States talk? He was awesome. It's so exciting to come after him. He's like one of my programming heroes. So I'm excited for this. Cool. So I'm excited to talk today. I see a lot of our senior Elixir developers, but I also see a lot of our people that are doing a lot of front-end work. So it's really cool to see that combination of both back-end Elixir developers and people that are new to Elixir and people that primarily do JavaScript. This is a really exciting talk for me to give because my journey with Elixir has really changed how I thought about programming in general and how I think about JavaScript and how I write all my code. So that's about this. What we're going to talk about today, a little bit about like what problems. So a little bit about the problems that SalesLoft's looking at and how we had the opportunity to come to Elixir and how it served us really well. So how it fits SalesLoft needs and how Elixir changed how I thought about JavaScript and just programming in general. So a little about me, I'm Grant Powell. I go by @G on Slack. I've been at SalesLoft for about 18 months. I enjoy swimming, boxing, rock climbing, golfing, and bar trivia. So a little bit about like my first love in programming. Back in the day, all through college, I worked in research labs and I wrote research code and it was all Python. I loved Python. I knew everything about Python. Python was so great. And I thought there could be no other languages beside Python that I would ever want to use because that would be silly. So during that time, I got into web development and I love web development. So I made tools that help my fraternity run better. So I made voting apps and single transferable vote apps. This is one of my favorites on the screen. It was a Django app that the exec board would log on and make an event. And to keep attendance at the event, all the brothers would take Snapchats and it would sign them into the event, the QR code. And I'll let you guys figure out how that one worked, but that was one of my favorites. So about 2-ish years ago, I met Kyle Porter at a event I was at. He told me about how SalesLoft was building web apps that help people. I ended up interviewing and getting the job. So I've worked there ever since. It's been awesome. So my first day at SalesLoft was my first day ever looking at Rails code. And I went from Python is the best thing ever, why would I ever want to do Python, to Ruby on Rails is the best thing ever, why would I want to do anything else? And you get that because Rails is amazing and you are so productive and everything is beautiful. And Rails is great. And SalesLoft love Rails. SalesLoft Rails paid for the beer and the food in this building, and it helped us grow and iterate and be great. The Rails community is awesome. Everything they're trying to do, gems like Doorkeeper help us run our single sign-on. Active Record helps us manage our database. Rails is great. So about a year and a half ago, this is kind of how I saw the world. I love Python and Ruby and everything else. Why would you do that? Because Python and Ruby were so great. That's not as true anymore. Now I'm starting to realize that like different problems have different languages that work well with them. So you really need to adapt your language to your problem. But this is how I used to see it. So SalesLoft is in this really cool phase. And one of the most exciting things to me is we're growing really fast. So not only are we growing in terms of how many requests we need to serve per minute, but also how fast we're trying to scale the dev process, how big we can make our applications. This is probably the most interesting opportunity we ever have is this is our headcount over the past year. We've more than doubled. This is the second year of almost more than doubling. So that leads to opportunities for us to be better at performance and being better at making our developers productive, even if they aren't the architect of the entire app. So yeah, it's going from 5 to 6 figures RPM. It's like really where we're at right now. So we began to start feeling some Rails pain. And like it was great for a long time, but then all of a sudden our test suites were slowing down. And we're realizing that because of the way that Rails structures their stuff, every single spec that we have in our test suite requires the database, all 20,000s of them. So it's taking 20 minutes to run it all. The system's very intertwined. So like if you've ever written Rails, one of the great things is that you don't have to have parentheses on your method calls. But one of the worst things is that you don't have to put parentheses on your method calls. So is a lot of times you'll do account.people or whatever, and you're launching off 3 queries and you don't even know it. It looks like it's just part of the object that you already have. And performance is always an issue for us. It's not an issue, it's an opportunity for us. We're always trying to balance performance. It's always something we're looking at. And as we scale, like managing that and keeping up. So we really needed kind of a new way to approach problems as we scaled. And the 2 big things that we were looking at are performance and scalability, but also developer productivity. And so thinking back to me, I'm coming from this Ruby and Python background, and like coming from the scientific community, you know one thing is that you're either fast or productive. And the research teams that are working in C are going to have very fast code, and they're going to be able to solve big problems. And the research teams that are working in Python are going to have slower code, but they're able to iterate faster. So like coming from that background, this is always the thing I saw. So I'm going to say one of my first controversial things tonight. I'm more than happy to talk about it next. I made this graph after years of research. Not really, I just kind of threw some logos on there. But this is kind of like how I saw the world is you're either really low level and you can get very fast, or you're very high level and you can be productive and you can write code very quickly and you can test and you can iterate, but you're also very slow. So with this going through my head, how can we possibly solve the problem of being productive and fast? So like, imagine when you see this on the Phoenix website, and Phoenix, for those of you guys who don't know, is the Elixir kind of Rails-ish thing. Productive, reliable, and fast, which are the exact things we want. Spoiler, very smart people at SalesLoft, like Ben and Steve, have brought Elixir into our stack, and we're super happy about it. The rest of this presentation is really just a love story between a company and a virtual machine. So Elixir is based on Erlang, for those of you guys that are newer to Elixir. And Erlang is amazing, but it's also kind of old school. It was designed for telecommunication companies. It's designed to run all our national infrastructure. It's designed to always be up. It's designed to be highly resilient. It's designed to be highly concurrent. It's built with all that in mind. It's super fast. Its docs look like, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever like worked with the Apache docs or like any of the old school Linux utilities, but like this is the thing you fear when you look at the docs, like, they're not pretty, so this must be hard to work with. I can judge a language very quickly now just by looking at their homepage and how good their logo is. So, but yeah, so you look at this and you don't, it doesn't look like much, but this is the most amazing piece of software in the entire world. And Elixir wraps that. So Erlang provides all this power of a tank, and when you need to drop down and do really impressive concurrent stuff, you have all the power. And then Erlang has that. And then Elixir is like a Bentley. It's super easy to program in. It gives you all the productivity you could ever need, and it's very comfortable to write and test. So that's really what Elixir is for us. This is, I don't know if you guys have seen The Incredibles, but in the beginning of the movie, he has a car and he's just driving it normally, but then when he needs to, he like presses the button and becomes the super fast convert car. That's pretty much what Elixir is that it's super nice to drive until you actually need it, and then you can like jettison into Erlang land and just crush it. It's not great for every problem, and I definitely want to say that. Erlang is not the be-all, end-all. It's not super great at number crunching or other stuff. It's just really, really good at the problems that we're faced with, which is high concurrency and high developer program performance. So yeah, I was always seeing this as like from object-oriented languages. So my question was, how can Elixir be so fast and performant? And the answer is functional programming. That's really where the crux of this talk comes in, is Elixir is based in functional programming, and that's how it's able to be so fast and performant. So those are the 2 things that kind of come from functional programming, that virtual machines can be very efficient, but also developers can be productive. And Elixir is a lot like Mr. Miyagi for me. It's like, you don't realize why it's not letting you do the stuff you want to do until way later, and then you realize, oh, wow, that's how I can write better code. So that's what functional programming is for me, is like all the things that I want to do from Rails and Elixir that I can't are probably bad for me. I shouldn't do those. So then the question, a lot of you guys do JavaScript. I think if you, again, this is one of my highly advanced charts that I did a lot of research into. It's not at all. So the real question is JavaScript, should you write it object-oriented or functional? And JavaScript lets you do both. It gives you the full power to do whatever you want to do. So that's what, for me, switching my mindset on JavaScript from using all the features to constraining myself, maybe I shouldn't be doing some of the things that might be bad for my This is from Star Wars, where you don't know if which side he's going on. Not that object-oriented programming is bad, it's just that. For the problems that we're faced with, I've gained a lot from functional programming. So like, what does it mean not to be an object-oriented language? Because for me, I was coming from this very object-oriented background. I knew what classes were, I knew what inheritance was, I knew what a method was. I had this abstraction in my head that I could set a variable and then I could mutate it. And Elixir, you can't do any of that. It doesn't have classes, it doesn't have instances of classes, it doesn't have subclasses, it doesn't have mutable state. What it does have are immutable values like strings, numbers, maps, tuple structs, and functions. So let's start with kind of what immutable means in terms of Elixir and how that makes coding easier. And this is actually an image from immutable.js, but so foreshadow. So like mutation seems cool in the XML, but really it's probably not such a great idea for your programming. And I'm gonna actually have you guys take a guess. As a front-end developer at SalesLoft, what is the scariest word to see in code? Deep?
Scope.
It's scope. Scope is just this grab bag of mutable state that all your controllers are depending on. And then everything's touching it, and all your problems are coming from what touched what when, and all these things are happening. Scope is the essence of mutable state, and it makes things seem easier at the beginning, but until you start to get into it, and then scope. So JavaScript is actually starting to move towards this Elixir philosophy of once you set something, it doesn't change. And I'm gonna go ahead and like preface this here. Some of the things that Elixir does by not letting you do mutations or classes and stuff, let it have a very highly optimized VM for that. But like in JavaScript, you want to use libraries like immutable because they'll do all the optimizations for you. Whereas if you're just creating a lot of objects on the fly, that could get non-performant very quickly. Whereas Elixir will just do that for you under the hood. So my takeaway in JavaScript now is I should be favoring immutable values. I should be writing code that is returning copies of objects instead of getting an object that's mutating and then knowing that some other function that also has a reference to the object is also relying on that. So that was my big takeaway from immutability in Elixir, that I can use that in JavaScript to write better functions. And just digging into functions. So one of the things that really threw me is how could you have a whole language based on functions? When I started doing functional programming. And I think the real confusion came from, in the object-oriented world, function doesn't really mean function, it just means something that I do that looks like a script that lives somewhere else. So in Elixir, it has all these things like you must return a value from a function, you can't mutate anything because everything's immutable. I take an input and return an output. A lot of times that means just a completely different struct that happens to look like something else. And a lot of times Elixir encourages you through this immutability to write pure functions. So you can always test what goes in and what comes out and lets you write a lot of pure code. So my takeaway in JavaScript is I should really start writing pure functions. I should try to break things into functional thoughts. I should write things that don't mutate objects. I should create new objects. And that's led to a lot of clearer code in my JavaScript. The next thing is composability. So a big theme in Elixir is now I have all these functions that are pure or take an object and return an object. And now I can compose them in interesting ways. So your goal in Elixir is always to combine functions. So this is the function double, which doubles a number, function add 10, which adds 10 to a number, and the function explain, which, stop screaming out. The function explain, which explains, puts in a string with an exclamation mark. So that's kind of really ugly at the bottom when I compose double, add 10, and explain. You have to read it from inside out. So Elixir saw that, and so like we love composability, but we want it to be readable, so they invented the pipe operator. The pipe operator is the best thing to come to any language ever. F# also has it. And you can start writing code like this. Say I take 1, and I pass it to the function double, and I take the output of that, and I pass it to the function add 10, and I take the output of add 10, and pass it to the function explain. So that's just function composition of immutable values, and this is a really good way to build small pieces of functionality and string them together. So my takeaway in JavaScript is I can do all of this in JavaScript, and JavaScript has really good functional tools for me to work with that. So I find myself writing a lot of lambdas. I find myself using Ramda, which is a library that gives you a lot of these composability tools. So the Ramda function pipe is exactly the same as the Elixir function pipe. It will take the output of one function and put it in the output of the next, And then the next big thing about Elixir is thinking in streams. So Elixir doesn't really have arrays in the same way that other languages do. It has lists, and lists are just heads and tails. So a lot of times you just think of a stream as a value plus maybe something else. And the cool thing is now we can start thinking of our pipelines as streams. And you'll notice that we didn't change any of the functions here. We literally just said, take the same function, but for every element, do this. And then pipe it to something that takes every element and does this, and takes every element and does this. So it lets you think in streams. And I can replace that list of 1, 2, 3, 4 with something coming out of the database or a bunch of web requests or whatever. But it lets me use the same functionality, but compose it differently based on the stream that I'm using. And the really, really performant part of that is now all of a sudden I can start to talk about different computation strategies with the same set of functions. So at the top, I'm just doing everything in thread. And the second one, I'm using the stream module, which will lazily do everything and not do the next thing until it's actually called. And the bottom one, I'm actually farming it out to multiple processors to do everything in parallel. And notice I never changed any of the functions. I just changed how I composed them and how I acted on a different stream. So my big takeaway in that in JavaScript is JavaScript gives me these amazing tools to build up these streams and act on the same way. So I find myself using map a lot, filter a lot, reduce a lot, and thinking of big lists of items as things I need to reduce and map and filter down into what I need. One of my biggest points of pride that I'm hoping to never change is I've never shipped an if for loop into production for JavaScript at SalesLoft. And I'm probably going to write ridiculous code to get away from that until, but yeah, so a lot of map, a lot of reduce, function composition, and that. It lets you build composable, testable pieces of code and then bring them into JavaScript. So bringing back to how I write JavaScript differently after learning Elixir and learning functional programming. Things I use a lot now are functions, encapsulating pieces of logic into functions that take pure values and turn them into different pure values. Function compositions of taking lots of little functions and putting them together in order to make bigger pieces of functionality that I can test. And objects that represent values instead of instances of a class. And one of the things about JavaScript that I really try to avoid are things like this. This is the quintessential, I'm mutating things, I'm treating this like an instance. Crazy things happen with the this keyword. If you look at the Mozilla Developer Network page, it's like 4 screen lengths of just crazy this rules. I avoid prototypical inheritance. I think that is a path to destruction. The class keyword usually is something that I tread lightly with, and the new keyword usually signifies to me that I'm trying to create an instance of a class instead of functions that operate on values. Cool. Can I take your questions now? Tiger.
So I guess my first question is about saying that you like to use ability in JavaScript now. How important is it to you to use a library that enforces immutable data structures versus just being aware of the way you're using the primitives that JavaScript provides to not use inheritance and classes and anything that you pass around?
Great question. So the question is, how important is it to use a library for immutability and immutability actions as opposed to just JavaScript primitives and understanding how they're, did I get that?
Yep.
Cool. So I'll just start with a little bit of something that never made sense to me in programming and that I've always looked at is like, when are you passing by reference and when are you passing by value in Java? And I don't know if you guys have dealt with that, but that is a very complex question and leads to a lot of just weird bugs that you wouldn't expect. So in Elixir, it's really nice because it seems like everything is passed by value. Like, as far as your functions are concerned, everything in the world is just a value. And when you pass it to a function, you have your own copy because you can't mutate it, so it doesn't matter. But under the hood in Elixir, it's amazing because it's really just all passed by reference, so it's lightning fast. So it seems like sending messages with like structs in them would be expensive because you have to copy all that data, but on the same node, it's not because you're just passing a reference that can also be used by that piece of memory. So when you go to JavaScript, that doesn't become true anymore. Because JavaScript is mutable, the runtime can't say, oh, you just get a reference. I may have to actually make a new thing. So that can become expensive when like I have an object that represents all the users mapped to their actions or whatever. And I just want to change one of them, but I want to make a new immutable copy of the whole thing. If I'm just changing one person in a list of 10,000, I have to copy 10,000 things and do that a bunch of times. So immutable.js is nice because they'll handle all the actual mutability under the hood for you. and do it. So like high churn data structures where you're changing things a lot and iterating over it, you're probably going to use immutable, but like probably with smaller lists, you can build immutability out of your own stuff. Object.assign is a good way to do that. Hunter?
So on the note of pure functions and pipelines in JavaScript, how would you structure your code so that, let's say you had multiple impure, let's say API calls?
Whoa, okay. No pressure now that I'm on this. I guess, do you want me to start from the beginning?
Please.
Okay. On the note of pipelines and functional JavaScript, let's say that you are calling out to multiple microservices as part of a set of processes in a given flow. How would you structure your code?
Great question. So I'll kind of answer that with, it sounds like you're calling out and doing some impure things like talking to a microservice, and then you're coming back and doing some processing and then calling out to a microservice. So the really cool thing about composability is you can structure each of those pieces of your pipeline as a pure function until it comes the time to actually do the impure thing. So like your pipeline will probably look at impure thing where I go get the thing, and then pipeline where I process the result, pipeline where I process the result, then do the impure thing. So you can still group that pure part as a pure function while putting the part of your pipeline where you actually do the impure thing in there too. So like Elixir is really nice because it lets you do case statements really easily. So you can have pattern matching and do all sorts of like switches on that. So you can have that inside your pipeline. In JavaScript, case statements are much harder. It'd be cool if JavaScript had pattern matching. Does that answer the question? Put all your pure code together, and then in your pipeline, you can still have that, but make sure that the next function in the pipeline handles whatever input it gets.
Sweet. So this question is, I'm more just curious about maybe your preferred way of going about it versus maybe how you would do it like at work. So in Elixir, state is going to be stored in either like a gen server, which is basically a container for state, or maybe you just keep the state at like let's say you're building a controller. Maybe you just sort of build state up as you progress through, passing it down and across your functions, in which case you might not be persisting state. So there's sort of like two ways of handling state in Elixir. Like how does that, I'm really curious about the type of container ideas that you have around how state would be preferred to be stored in JavaScript for apps that you'd work on.
Great question. So to start with, you guys that aren't as familiar with Elixir is Elixir will let you do something called a gen server, which is an abstraction of state. And it's still really cool because you can think of it still like a pure function that's a reduction over just the messages that gen server gets. So that's a really cool way of thinking about it, but we don't have that in JavaScript. So the next question is, how do you start to do that in our code specifically? So,
well, just in JavaScript.
Yeah.
And your preferred way of going about it in JavaScript.
Yeah, so I really, really like Elm and Reason. That's not a super popular opinion. So they have their way of doing it with reducers, and it still is a pure function where you send a message up and it comes back down. Our code is specifically a lot of Angular that handles the state in kind of a controller-y, mutating way that reaches down into presentational JavaScript. So like if I was redoing it tomorrow, I'd probably think about how can I model my state at the top level as a function of, as a reduction across all the things that happened into a state, kind of like Redux does, and then have all the presentational components just read that state and in a pure way do their rendering.
This is maybe a little tangential to the, kind of the mission statement of the talk, but I was wondering if you could maybe go into a little more depth on how the flow currying works. You said it breaks it up across multiple processes, but it doesn't seem like a distributed computation. It's still serial, right? So how does that work?
Oh yeah, for sure. That is probably one of the coolest parts of Elixir. Cool. So the question is, how does the flow work in Elixir? And that kind of goes back to the base abstraction of Erlang. And for those of you guys that know a little bit about Linux, is I can spawn up processes that do things. And spawning a process is kind of expensive. They're big things. They're hard to communicate between the two. Using threads is usually a lot faster. So Erlang looks at that as like, process model is fantastic, but we need to make this really, really cheap. So in Erlang, you can just have tens of thousands of processes. Spawning up a new process is really quick. Processes just represent a computation that happens in time. And because of the semantics of the language and immutability and pure functions, you can parallelize that really easily. And you can think of a process locally the same as you think of a process that's across the network. So like you can have this networking effect, and we do really cool things with that at SalesLoft. So this flow is building on top of that. So usually you'd use it for something much bigger. Like I have to map reduce over millions of events, and I want to do it over lots of nodes and lots of processes. So like I have something that's pushing data into the stream, and then I have separate Erlang processes for each step. And between each step, I'm sending a message to that process as, hey, here are the results from my computation. Run the function that you have on it, and then pass it to the next stage. But the really cool thing is that the Erlang VM will look at that and like do it all in parallel and spread it out over all your cores. So you're able to get parallelism really easily from the fact just the language provides that, and it provides easy message passaging between these processes, and it provides abstraction over processes that act independently, but under the hood, Beam is handling all that. So that's the really cool part we get out of Beam, and that's why Erlang is so cool.
So I was just going to ask, so I'm seeing it now. So it only works on computations that can be parallelized. So if you threw a reduce in the middle, that would break, right? Because that's a serial computation. You can only do it with the results of the whole set.
That's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. So what you do is you can have parts of flow that will say, hey, go ahead and reduce this part in front of you. And like that's documented in the module. For the purpose of this, I just made a map, but yeah, you're dead right. And you can build a really cool map reduce server just inside an Erlang node and scale it really well.
But Flow does maintain ordering, is that right?
Possibly. I don't actually remember the name. I don't think it does. Based on I don't know. There's someone that knows the answer to that.
Hey Grant, if I want to learn more about like implementations, I've learned like a high level overview of Elixir through like web tutorials and stuff. If I want to actually dig in and learn about implementation details like you've just described, like who should I follow? What should I read?
Great question. Who should you follow and what should you read? So I'm lucky that I work at SalesLoft, and like we have a lot of Elixir experts around us. The docs are fantastic. That's probably one of my favorite parts of Elixir is how detailed the documentation is, and every link will link you directly into what it is. And then the Erlang docs are really good too. So what you'll find a lot of times is Elixir is just a thin wrapper around something that Erlang figured out a long time ago. Learning in Erlang for great good is really good for like how OTP apps.
Is that a book?
Yeah, it's a free PDF, but it's also a book. Okay, cool. And then for functional programming, learning Haskell for great good is phenomenal. And it really changes, that's what really changed how I thought about programming and like taught me functional programming.
Try not to laugh when I ask this question. When Bruce Tate was here, you asked him if Elixir was functional enough for him, based on, and you talked a lot about bringing functional aspects of Elixir into JavaScript, but you didn't answer the question that night. So I'm curious to hear, now that you're up on the stage, I can ask you to answer that question. Is Elixir functional enough for you?
Is Elixir functional enough for me? Yeah. So what I love about Elixir, the semantics are great, but the Beam is fantastic. And everything about Bogdan's Erlang abstract machine is phenomenal. And it makes really, really hard problems easy because people have spent billions of dollars figuring out how to make Erlang great to run all of our nation's telecommunications process. So that's my favorite part of Elixir, bar none. That's not to say there aren't things about Elixir that I think could benefit from other functional languages. When it comes to functionalness and like purity, Elixir is probably closer to like object-oriented languages than something like Haskell. And like if you've ever written in Haskell, that will just bend your mind about how you think about programming. So I'd love to see something like a really strong type system or other things like that come into the language. That'd be the one thing I miss is like Elixir will still let you do whatever impure thing you want, whereas like languages like Haskell will be like, you can't do impure things at all unless you specifically say you're doing impure things. So the purity by default in Haskell is the one thing I probably want to bring into Erlang.
So you said you moved to Elixir partly to have a better testing strategy, a more performant testing strategy. Do you find that the JavaScript you write this way is easier to test or testing faster?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things that we're kind of, yeah. So the question was on testing and testing in Elixir, testing in JavaScript, and just like what that looked like in Rails. And I'll start with how we kind of feel in Rails. And I think the whole room of sales lofters kind of feels this way is that we write a lot of Rails code, and the way that Rails kind of guides you to write code really has you test the whole way through. And that is the bonus of like, you're testing a lot of the stack, but that also is a negative, you're testing a lot of the stack. So there's not a lot of room for like unit testing. So like most of our tests require the database, which makes them kind of slow. Then you get into Elixir world where everything is a process and everything's immutable, and it really favors pure functions. So you can write code that tests the transformation of a pure function to a pure function that runs asynchronously from all your tests. And like our Elixir test suites that I've written are like 0.3 seconds, and our Rails test suites are like an hour. So that's the real thing, is having pure functions and doing them in parallel is what gives Erlang its power. And then when you get into JavaScript, if you start to write these pure functions, you still get the benefit of there's not a lot of mocking going on. You're just testing transformations and parts of pipelines before you test the whole pipeline itself. That's where the real benefit comes in, is the structure. The code leads to the test as opposed to you can anything special about the tests.
Cool, thanks.
No problem.
So my question is, are you using these JavaScript, like, are you using these functional techniques with JavaScript in your SalesLoft work? And if so, does that cause friction with other developers? Like, it seems like you need buy-in to say, this is how we're going to do it on this project.
That's a great thing, and we've had long, passionate conversations. So one of the guiding principles we've decided is we'd like to be more functional, more reactive. And I think we've really seen it come out in the code. And we're in the process of saying, we have this Angular thing that looks a lot like a Rails app on the front end. Yeah, and we're trying to make that look less like a Rails app. So like one of our guiding principles is how can we be more functional with JavaScript? Our React code is very, very much, I take in props and I do a pure thing based on it. And we're getting good at that. And we're starting to move up the state tree and replace some of this Angular code. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what it's going to look like to be functional, to be reactive, to have good state management, to have all this stuff together. But it's looking like we're moving towards that. And the other part is like we're investing in new technologies. It's just going to take a lot of the complexity out of our front-end code, like GraphQL. So, which we're looking at building a GraphQL in server in Elixir. So that's always fun.
I've done that. It's cool. So are you using like Lambda and immutable in your JavaScript?
I don't personally contribute a ton of the JavaScript, and we don't use it here. We do use Lodash. I think we use Lodash FP too, but I haven't personally written that. I write, like, for fun, what I'm thinking, and like if I'm writing code for me, I use Haskell. So like that fills all the skills of writing functional code, and then it just becomes how do I translate this Haskell program into JavaScript? The other thing about JavaScript that's kind of an opportunity for the VMs to improve is there's no tail call recursion. So like if you're writing recursive functions, which is super common in Elixir or Haskell or whatever, you can easily just blow out the stack and ruin your VM. So something to avoid. Is that dagger?
I'm not going to throw this across the room.
Pretty much every all hands that happens.
So you mentioned a handful of features in Elixir that have influenced the way you write JavaScript, and you found ways to implement some of these concepts in JavaScript. Are there any features in JavaScript that you think would help towards the same end in Elixir?
That's a really good question. Of what in JavaScript do I like that would be good for Elixir? Off the top of my head, I've never been a huge fan of the Lambda syntax in Elixir. Like anonymous functions in JavaScript are great. I'm a huge fan. In Elixir, they're not as pretty. And like the capture operator, I think leads to some uglier code. So that's syntactic sugar that I would like. As far as other like language specific features, I really like what Elixir for what it does. So it'd probably have a different answer if I was using it in a different context, but like the concurrency model is fantastic. I really like the functional aspects of it. So nothing specifically I can think of. All the mutability stuff can stay out of Elixir.
I'll ask one more. Maybe it'll be the last one. It seems like no one else has questions going, so maybe it will be. What is something that you wish you knew earlier that you now know through about Elixir or about something that's helped you out that might help other people out?
I'll just tell you, I struggled to learn Elixir because I had to put away the idea that I could mutate state and like thinking object-oriented. So I remember one of my first projects in Elixir ever was I had this idea that we could figure out how long you viewed an image based on how many bytes we wrote before the socket closed. So I implemented this in Elixir, and all I wanted to do in the world was have a global variable that said how many bytes were written so I could just display that on a different web page. And in Rails, that's easy. You know, just literally do the $sign and you have a global variable in your VM. And I spent, I don't know, like 45 minutes doing the original prototype and like 2 hours just trying to figure out how to have a global variable in Elixir. And I'm like digging into etch tables and I'm reading about gen servers. And then looking back, global variables and stuff like this are a really bad idea. So I'm glad you can't do it. But going into it with like, I don't have objects. I don't have instances anymore. I don't have classes. I don't have methods. How do I write my code in spite of that? Was probably a big hurdle. But once I got over it, I don't think I could ever go back the other way to, I don't think I will want to go back the other way into more of an object-oriented programming for the stuff we do.
So earlier, I love your bit on using the right tool for the right tool for the right job and finding the language that solves the problem the best. One thing for me with Elixir is I often don't need real-time system. So is that something that you struggled with when you first went to Elixir? And if not, what was easier about it than you thought?
Is the question like, what's the right tool for the job in terms of?
Not necessarily. So we use Elixir for things that sells lots that aren't, or we don't need real time for. And I think that's all right. So maybe so the first part is what language would you choose for non-real time, and for and the two for the projects that you work in, when we don't need it, are there extra pains that you have to deal with?
Oh, for sure. So is Elixir the right choice for smaller projects, and are there extra pains? I think that's really interesting. And I think looking at an individual project may not give you the full story, especially at a big company like us, or a bigger dev team like ours. So like one thing I've worked for on my team is we release a lot of Elixir apps. And like we do hit those pain points of we don't know how to do JWTs or whatever. We don't know how to do node clustering. So we're the ones that are like the first ones to figure that out, or the first ones to write special test cases or like whatever. So I think that's, you know, maybe that slowed us down on that project, but the valuable thing is now we have that experience to share with the team. We can point to examples like this is how we did this in Portal, and now you can do it over in your side project. So a lot of that is like the learning is very valuable. And the other part is like a lot of our applications do really benefit from this real time. So we have certain applications that are really high throughput, and doing them in the Rails, we'd have struggle really hard. But by having that Elixir knowledge, we were able to build a really good live website tracking server. Latency is another thing we deal with because we deal with calls. So like we're building out our new calls system in Elixir because we can be very latent. But that learning came from stuff that wasn't those things. So I think the learning is very important. So like I would say like just building smaller things in Elixir is great for us because it teaches us how to build bigger things in Elixir. And then the other question is like, did we hit hurdles? And the answer is yes, of course. I mean, there's less articles on Elixir, there's less libraries. But for the things we're doing, I still think it's a really good choice. And I would recommend, no matter what you're building, to consider Elixir, just even as a learning thing to teach our developers about the ecosystem and how to build bigger things.
Can you talk about a little more about you mentioned that a lot of our apps do benefit from the real-time capabilities of Elixir. If I'm writing just like a web API, what does Elixir provide that you can't get from another language that has threading?
Great question. What does Elixir give for just small projects? So for me, like I could do a whole presentation on why Phoenix is amazing, but with Rails, you get this request response lifecycle, right? Like the request comes in and then you mutate it and it goes around and then it comes out the middleware on the other side, right? And in Phoenix, it's not that. You have these things called plugs, which take an immutable representation of the request and then transform it. So then you have all these composable plugs and you can build these pipelines exactly the same. And I think that thinking about how web request works has really benefited me. So like I just think in terms of plugs now, and that's a way easier way to compose how my web application works than I think building out Rails apps are. And I think the other thing that we got to be careful of is I have this deadline. I want to do Elixir and I have this deadline, so I'm going to do Rails. And then it comes around and, you know, you never learned how to do Elixir. The team never build the experiences and have the things in Elixir, so you never build more Elixir apps. So it's a balance. Rails has a lot of good qualities, but building functional Elixir code is easier to, we get a lot of benefits in testability and scalability, performance, so.
Elixir, obviously, if you want to like take the most advantage of it, like supervisor and gen server and like managing processes, it takes like sometimes to ramp up compared to Rails, where like you can scaffold like everything with a snap of a finger. Do you think like in terms of like library, something could be done better to make the language more approachable, and then like slowly for the user like unfold this I don't know, like a library that could manage this for you, like provides a better API for processes or supervisor? I don't know.
Yeah, is there things that Phoenix could do to be more approachable to like other developers? And yeah, I think so. I think that goes back to like the slide I had on the tank and the Bentley. Is my experience with Phoenix is like it's pretty easy to get started, and then it's not until you really want to reach down and do something crazy or perform it that you have to go down into Erlang. So it's nice that you could stay completely within Elixir and do like the nice, like pretty things until like you really need that power, and then it's there when you reach for it. Or in Rails, sometimes I feel like, you know, it's pretty all the way, and then when you reach down to do something like more intense, it's just not there. You're grasping at straws. So I think it's just time and articles and community and stuff like this and people getting interested in it. And the functional programming is, I think, the biggest hurdle that I faced. So helping other people like see functional programming and bring that to mainstream. Cool.
Hey, how you doing? So the question is, at Salesloft, what front-end frameworks are you using? You said Angular. Are you all transitioning away from Angular? Because Angular is like all object-oriented.
Yeah, so Angular is great, and it really helped us build the app that we have today. And like we appreciate what Angular did so much. We're finding that it's not doing as much as we want. There's a lot of complexity that we kind of weren't accounting for. So we're trying to move towards a more React-based presentational components, and then probably a different data fetching layer. There's a lot of talks in flux, and then there's a lot of people in this room that are much more versed in it than I am. But we're probably going to try to move away from Angular.
I guess to like React, or is that?
Definitely React for the view layer, and maybe GraphQL, maybe. There's talks about like the more complex state being managed by Redux. There's all sorts of talks. We're not super set on anything, unless someone else has different input on that.
Can I make an announcement?
Yeah.
So this is my first Elixir meetup, and I just kind of stumbled upon, I won't say stumbled upon, but through mishap, I got 2 additional programming Elixir 1.6, Dave Thomas books. I'm giving them away. So, you take one? Okay. So I got 1 left. So if anyone wants it, okay, there you go. All right.
Thank you. Ben has an announcement. SalesLoft is hiring. If you're interested in Elixir and joining Atlanta's best place to work. Well, yeah, thanks you guys for coming out. Thank you.
So like that doesn't work because it's only Ruby and Rails, not Ruby based off of